Now in this hands-on, we'll be using PySpark, or we'll be using PySpark code to do the transformation and write data to Redshift. We'll be reading from OLTP data source, which is in our case Aurora MySQL. We'll read the records from there, do some transformation and load it to Redshift. If you are using Glue and if you want to load record to Redshift without using Glue API or without using the Glue Studio, there are certain considerations when you are using PySpark. The first thing is that everything would remain the same except for the writing of the final data frame to Redshift. So we'll have to use a Glue connection for Redshift. We can use JDBC driver to connect to Redshift and write it there, but there can be a lot of errors and it might be a little difficult to troubleshoot those errors. So it is always better to use a Glue connection for Redshift. This is the first consideration. The second consideration is that the final data frame has to be converted to a dynamic frame. The reason is because we'll be using Glue API to write to Redshift. We'll be performing all the other operations using PySpark APIs or Spark APIs, but to write to Redshift, we'll be using the Glue API, which is write data frame. So that's why we'll have to convert the final data frame to a dynamic frame. And then we'll have to write it as a dynamic frame. So we'll have to write the dynamic frame to Redshift using the Glue connection. The code would be more or less similar and will not be skipping other Glue options or other Glue imports that we have. One important Glue import is this one, wherein we are importing the dynamic frame from AWS Glue.dynamic frame. So this is needed because it would be needed to create a dynamic frame from the final data frame. This is the initial code. Then the remaining code you will write as using PySpark because we have the Spark session available here. So we'll be using the Spark session to write all our transformations. We'll be creating multiple data frames using data frame reader for JDBC connections. We'll do all the joins, all the transformations, aggregations, etc. And then finally, when the data frame is ready, which you are planning to write to Redshift, that has to be converted to dynamic frame using the from df API, which I had told you earlier. So once we convert it to dynamic frame, then we'll have to write the dynamic frame to Redshift. And the syntax is a little heavy, so please bear with me. The first thing that we have to do is use this glue context dot write dynamic frame, and we'll be using the from options. The reason we are using from underscore options because we want to make sure that we can write to a Redshift table even though the table is not there in Glue data catalog. A better option is to use a Glue data catalog. If the table is available in Glue data catalog, then would not use the from underscore options. But here we are using from underscore options because the table is not available in Glue data catalog. And in most of the scenarios, this is what it would happen. There's an open bracket and closed bracket here, so everything will go inside of this. There are a lot of syntaxes and options and parameters they'll provide, but that would be inside of this glue context dot write dynamic frame dot from options. Then we'll have to provide the input dynamic frame using the frame keyword. Here we are mentioning which dynamic frame to write to. Now this input dynamic frame would be the final data frame that we want to write to a Redshift and which has been converted to a dynamic frame. So we'll have to mention that dynamic frame here using the frame keyword. Then we'll have to mention the connection type as Redshift. It is pretty obvious why it is Redshift, and then we'll have to provide multiple connection options in a curly braces. So this is the open curly brace and these are the options that we have to provide. Now remember, we are writing it as JDBC target but using a Redshift connection type. That's why you'll have to provide the Redshift JDBC URL, the user ID of Redshift. So whatever Redshift user is authorized to connect to the database or the cluster and write to the table, you have to provide that Redshift user and that user's password. So first is the URL, then user, then password. Then we have this option which is Redshift TMP dir, which is a temporary directory that we have to provide. The reason is because Glue first writes it to S3 and from there it is loaded to the Redshift table. That's how it happens. It writes to the temporary directory using CSV format, Parquet format. Actually, we can mention what format we want it to be. In most of the cases, it should be Parquet. So the final dynamic frame would be written to S3, and from there it would be copied to Redshift. Then you'll have to provide the IAM role. This is the Redshift role, the role which is associated with the Redshift cluster and which has access to read from S3 and write to S3. Then you'll have to use this keyword which is use connection properties, and I'll have to mention it as true. The reason we'll have to provide this because we'll be using a predefined glue connection to connect to Redshift because we are using the glue API. Then we provide the DB table wherein you'll have to mention the schema name and the table name followed by the connection name. This is also mandatory. We'll have to provide the name of the connection which we have already created for our case. Then we close these connection options and then we provide transformation context. We can also provide a format, what the format should be for the temporary files which are written to S3. It can be Parquet, it can be CSV, it can be any other format. In most of the cases, it should be Parquet. So this is how we write the code or the final data frame to Redshift using glue write dynamic frame option or using glue write dynamic frame API and then the from option keyword or the from option method wherein you'll have to pass multiple variables and their corresponding values. So this is the only glue API that we'll be using while writing to Redshift. Another important consideration is that because we are using a connection or we are using a Redshift connection, so the connection has to be provided in the job details. So this is how we provide connection in the advanced properties. In connections, we provide the connection name. So we'll have to add it manually in the job details. If we do not mention this, then the final writing will error out saying that it cannot make any connection or there should be some other error related to get sync or something of that sort. So that is the error message that will get. So make sure to add the connection manually in the job details itself. So let us go ahead and do some hands-on. What we are going to do is that we'll be loading this table in Redshift. I had already created this table. The previous table was loaded using the Glue Studio with a no-code experience, but this time we'll be using PySpark and we'll be writing to this cross-country transaction details, which has source country, destination country, total amount, and total count. So this is a transaction details count. So the input should be the transaction table. So this is the transaction table which have transaction ID, date, source account ID, amount, destination account ID, currency code. But we need the source country, destination country, total amount, and total count. So do not have the source country and the destination country. And we have account ID here. So looks like we'll have to join with the account table. So this is the account table, which has account ID, balance, and other columns, but it also does not have the source country and the destination country for the transaction, but it has customer ID. So which means we'll need the customer table. So this is the customer table. I have just shown a few columns. The customer table has a lot of other columns, but here we'll use the customer ID and its corresponding country to get the source country and the destination country. So I'll have to do some joining and aggregation, fetch records from these three tables and load it to Redshift. Let us go ahead and do the hands-on.